A reckless HOA Karen called the sheriff's department to harass my dad over a petty violation. Too bad for her. The sheriff instantly saluted and stood down because my dad is the chief of police. The morning began like any other in Maplewood Heights, calm, quiet, and orderly. The neat rows of brick houses stood beneath a pale orange sunrise, and the only sounds were birds chirping in the oak trees that lined the cul-de-sac. But the peace shattered when the wail of sirens tore through the stillness. Within moments, flashing blue and red lights washed over the pristine lawns, painting the street in urgent color. 2 sheriff's patrol cars came screeching around the corner and stopped abruptly in front of 214 Oak Ridge Lane, the Carter residence. Tires squealed, engines hummed, and neighbors stirred behind blinds and curtains, drawn by the sudden commotion that felt entirely out of place in their normally uneventful neighborhood. Leonard Grayson was already there, standing at the center of it all like a general awaiting his troops. The self-appointed king of Maplewood Heights, Leonard was dressed in his usual pressed khakis and polo, his silver hair perfectly combed back. But it was the smug smile on his face that stood out, a smile that said he believed victory was already his. He stood with his arms folded across his chest, chin raised, as if he had orchestrated the entire scene, and in a way, he had. "There he is," Leonard declared loudly, pointing toward the front porch of the Carter home as the deputies stepped out of their vehicles. "That man is in violation and refusing to comply. Arrest him." All eyes turned to Raymond Carter, who sat on the top step of his porch with a mug of coffee in his hand, watching the chaos unfold with the calm detachment of someone observing a scene rather than starring in it. He was a tall man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered and quietly imposing, his neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard giving him an air of authority even when he said nothing. If Leonard expected panic, he was disappointed. Raymond didn't rise or shout or even ask what this was about. He simply raised the mug to his lips, took a slow sip, and exhaled a faint breath that misted in the cool morning air. Deputy Harris, the younger of the 2 officers, shifted uneasily as he approached the porch. "Sir," he said, glancing back at Leonard, then at Raymond again. "Are you aware there's a complaint filed against you this morning?" Raymond looked at him over the rim of his mug, his tone polite but steady. "I heard someone was unhappy about a flagpole and a patch of flowers," he said. "But last I checked, those weren't criminal offenses." Leonard scoffed. "Don't play innocent, Carter. You were ordered to remove that structure weeks ago and refused. That's a direct violation of Maplewood Heights bylaws. This man is openly defying the association. He thinks he's above the rules, but he's not." Deputy Harris hesitated, glancing toward his partner, Sergeant Whitaker, an older, more seasoned officer who was quietly studying Raymond from a distance. Whitaker's brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of recognition passing over his face, as if the name Raymond Carter meant something more than Leonard realized. "Sir, are you sure about this?" Harris asked, lowering his voice and turning toward Leonard. "An arrest over a homeowner's violation isn't standard procedure." Leonard's patience snapped. He threw his hands into the air dramatically. "Of course I'm sure." "Do your job," he barked, his voice echoing across the cul-de-sac. A few neighbors gasped quietly from their porches. Others whispered among themselves, sensing something about this situation didn't feel right. Raymond finally set his mug down on the step beside him and rose to his feet. He didn't move quickly or aggressively, just a slow, deliberate motion that drew every eye in the street. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. "Deputy," he said, addressing Harris directly, "before you make any decisions you'll regret, I suggest you radio in and confirm exactly who you're dealing with." Harris blinked, confused. Leonard laughed. "Oh, spare us the theatrics, Carter," he sneered. "This isn't one of your courtroom dramas. You're just a stubborn man who thinks he doesn't have to follow the rules. Well, not this time. This time you'll answer for it." But Harris's expression had shifted from hesitation to something else now. Uncertainty, maybe even concern. Whitaker had stepped aside, speaking quietly into his radio, his gaze fixed on Raymond the entire time. A minute later, his radio crackled with a response. The sergeant's posture straightened, and a hint of color drained from his face. "Deputy," Whitaker called softly, motioning him back toward the patrol car. The 2 officers exchanged hushed words out of earshot, but Raymond could see the sudden stiffness in their shoulders and the subtle shift in their demeanor. They were no longer treating this like a routine complaint. Something had changed. Leonard, oblivious to the growing tension, strutted closer to the porch. "Go ahead, finish your little background check," he mocked. "It won't change the fact that this man has been a nuisance since the day he moved in. If we let him get away with this, others will follow. And then what? Chaos. That's what." Raymond didn't respond. He only watched, a faint trace of a knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. A smile that made Leonard pause for just a second. Then Whitaker stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Grayson," he said slowly, carefully choosing his words, "we're going to need to pause this for a moment." "Pause?" Leonard frowned. "Pause what?" "Arrest him already." Whitaker's eyes flicked briefly toward Raymond before returning to Leonard. "This man is Raymond Carter, former chief of police for this county." The silence that followed was instant and absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Leonard blinked as if he hadn't heard correctly. "What?" "That's right," Whitaker continued. "Chief Carter served this department for over 30 years, and unless I'm mistaken, he retired with distinction not even 2 years ago. If you're filing a complaint, we'll need to review it very carefully before any action is taken." The smugness drained from Leonard's face as whispers rippled through the watching crowd. A few neighbors who had once stayed silent now exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to quiet amusement. Raymond stood there, hands clasped loosely in front of him, as unbothered as he'd been when the first siren wailed. Leonard tried to recover, his words stumbling. I don't care who he was. He's still in violation." Whitaker cut him off gently. "And that's a civil matter, Mr. Grayson, not a criminal one, which means it's not something we're going to handle with handcuffs and sirens today." Raymond bent down, picked up his coffee, and took another sip as if nothing had happened. His eyes locked on Leonard's, and for the first time, the HOA president looked unsure of himself. Raymond didn't need to say anything more. The balance of power in the cul-de-sac had already shifted. Leonard swallowed hard, glancing around at the neighbors watching the spectacle. His plan had been simple: humiliate Raymond, make an example of him, and show everyone that the HOA's power was absolute. But instead, he had drawn public attention to a man who had once commanded the very police force he had just tried to use as a weapon. And as Raymond stepped back toward his door, a quiet, unreadable expression on his face, one truth settled over the crowd like the heavy morning air. Leonard Grayson had just made the worst mistake of his life. What Leonard didn't realize, what the entire neighborhood was about to find out, was that Raymond Carter wasn't just any homeowner. And by summoning law enforcement to intimidate him, Leonard had just lit the fuse on the biggest mistake of his life. Long before the morning patrol cars shattered the calm of Maplewood Heights, the neighborhood had already been living under the shadow of one man's iron-fisted rule: Leonard Grayson. To the casual observer, Leonard looked like any other retiree, mid-60s, always in pressed polos and khakis, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But those who lived under his authority knew better. Leonard wasn't content with a quiet retirement. He needed control, and the HOA presidency was the throne from which he ruled. Every inch of Maplewood Heights, from the shade of paint on a garage door to the length of grass on a lawn, was subject to his scrutiny. And he wielded that power with the precision of a man who had spent decades telling others how to live. "Rules are what keep a community civilized," Leonard liked to declare at meetings, his voice loud enough to silence dissent. "Without them, everything falls apart." But the neighbors knew that rules to Leonard meant control. He fined the Taylors across the street for leaving their trash cans out 9 minutes past pickup time. He forced old Mr. Delgado to repaint his fence, twice, because the shade of brown was too warm for community standards. He even once ordered a family to remove their string lights before December because they were seasonally premature. Most residents complied without question. It was easier to pay a fine than to endure Leonard's relentless harassment. But Raymond Carter was different. When Raymond moved into 214 Oak Ridge Lane, he did so with the quiet dignity of a man who had earned his peace. Decades of public service had taught him patience, resilience, and how to pick his battles. and this retirement home was supposed to be the final chapter of a long, demanding career. He had no interest in neighborhood drama. He paid his dues, followed the bylaws, and kept to himself. But from the moment Leonard learned who his new neighbor was, something inside him shifted. Raymond's calm presence unnerved him. Leonard was used to people backing down, apologizing, and rushing to correct even imagined mistakes. Raymond did none of that. He read every notice carefully, questioned vague citations, and, most infuriating of all, smiled politely when Leonard tried to lecture him. Leonard decided he needed to put Raymond in his place. He started with the usual tactics, a notice about an unapproved mailbox design, even though Raymond's mailbox matched the community standard, a warning about unauthorized landscaping because Raymond had planted a small rose bush near the walkway. Raymond simply replied with copies of the bylaws, highlighting the sections that proved him right. That response, logical, unbothered, and completely legal, drove Leonard mad. "He's testing me," Leonard muttered one afternoon to Harold, the HOA treasurer, as they reviewed violation forms in the clubhouse. "If we let him get away with this, the whole system collapses." Harold shifted uncomfortably. "It's just a rose bush, Len." "That's how it starts," Leonard snapped. "Today it's a rose bush. Tomorrow it's neon paint and RVS on lawns. I won't have this neighborhood turned into a circus." His obsession grew darker. He began sending Raymond threatening letters, each one more aggressive than the last. He accused him of neglecting property upkeep, despite Raymond's yard being one of the most pristine on the block. He filed anonymous complaints with the HOA board, all of which he himself reviewed and approved. At night, Leonard would stroll past Raymond's property under the guise of neighborhood watch, snapping photos with his phone. Once, Raymond spotted the faint red glow of a camera lens in the darkness and stepped onto the porch. "Something I can help you with, Leonard?" he asked, his tone even, almost amused. Leonard nearly dropped his phone. "Just community safety checks," he stammered before hurrying away. To most, Leonard's actions might have seemed petty, but they revealed something deeper, a growing fear that he was losing control. Raymond wasn't defiant in the loud, rebellious way Leonard was used to. He was polite. He was measured. And that made him dangerous. Leonard thrived on confrontation, but Raymond offered none. Instead, he disarmed Leonard's rage with civility, and that infuriated him more than open rebellion ever could. The rumors began next. Leonard whispered at board meetings that Raymond had been forced into retirement under questionable circumstances. He suggested to neighbors that Raymond was unstable and uncooperative. When no one seemed convinced, Leonard planted anonymous notes in mailboxes warning that Raymond was a threat to the community's harmony. Few believed the accusations, but the seeds of suspicion were planted. That was enough for Leonard. Still, Raymond did not waver. "People like Leonard burn themselves out," he told his son Cole one evening over dinner. "You just have to let them dig their own hole." But Leonard had no intention of burning out. If anything, his campaign was only intensifying. At one HOA meeting, he proposed new amendments to the bylaws, amendments so specific they could only apply to Raymond. "No freestanding flagpoles," one read. "No ornamental plantings within 5 feet of the walkway," read another. Several board members shifted uneasily. "Isn't this targeting?" one asked quietly. Leonard smiled thinly. "It's maintaining order." The amendments passed narrowly, thanks to Leonard's influence. Raymond received 2 new violation notices the following week, both citing rules that hadn't existed when he installed the flagpole in Rosebush. He appealed the fines immediately, but Leonard ignored the request. It was around this time that the night visits became more frequent. Several times, Raymond's motion sensor lights flicked on after midnight, revealing Leonard pacing the edge of his property with a flashlight. "He's crossing lines," Cole warned after hearing about the incidents. "I know," Raymond replied, his calm mask slipping just slightly. "But every line he crosses leaves a mark, one that'll matter later." And beneath that calm exterior, that was exactly what Raymond was doing, documenting everything. The letters, the fines, the late-night trespasses, all carefully logged. He knew men like Leonard well. They believed they were untouchable. They believed power meant protection. But power abused always left traces, and traces could bring down even the most arrogant tyrants. By the time Leonard called the sheriff that fateful morning, Maplewood Heights had already witnessed months of his tightening grip, fines over nonsense, threats of legal action, and attempts to isolate Raymond socially. And yet, through it all, Raymond remained patient, quietly building something Leonard couldn't see. Leonard believed he was untouchable. After all, he was the HOA president and had the board wrapped around his finger. Raymond, on the other hand, appeared indifferent, almost amused. But beneath that calm exterior, he was quietly preparing for a day Leonard would never forget. The morning was cool and calm, with a soft autumn breeze drifting through Oak Ridge meadows. Raymond Carter sat on his porch with his son Cole and grandson Michael, a pot of fresh coffee between them and the low murmur of their conversation mixing with the chirping of birds. It was the kind of morning Raymond cherished, quiet, steady, and far removed from the years he'd spent in the thick of police work. He leaned back in his chair, content. But that peace was about to be shattered. Across the street, Leonard Baxter was pacing in his living room, clutching a clipboard like a weapon. Weeks of fines, threats, and passive-aggressive notices hadn't worked. Raymond Carter refused to bow, and to Leonard that was unacceptable. His position as HOA president was supposed to give him power, unquestioned, unchallenged power, and yet this man, this stubborn retiree, was making a mockery of it. Every time Leonard walked by Raymond's yard and saw that new flagpole proudly flying the stars and stripes, it felt like a personal insult. "This ends today," Leonard muttered to himself, tightening his grip on the clipboard. He stormed out of his house, jaw set, and crossed the street with quick, sharp steps. Raymond noticed him coming from a distance and sighed quietly. "Brace yourselves," he murmured to Cole with a faint, knowing smile. "The storm approaches." Leonard marched right up to the porch, not bothering with pleasantries. "Raymond," he said curtly, holding up his clipboard like a badge, "we need to talk about that flagpole." Raymond stayed seated, calm and unbothered. "Good morning to you too, Leonard." "Don't play games," Leonard snapped, his voice already rising. "That flagpole violates HOA guidelines. You were warned. I'm here to give you one final chance. Take it down today, or we'll pursue legal action." Cole straightened in his chair, his tone polite but firm. "It's well within property regulations. We checked twice before installing it." Leonard ignored him. "You think you're above the rules because you've been here longer? Because people like you think they can do whatever they want?" Raymond's gaze remained steady. "No, Leonard. I follow the law, and the law says I'm within my rights. So no, I'm not taking it down." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then something in Leonard's face shifted. Frustration hardened into anger, anger into something darker. "Fine," he spat, lowering the clipboard. "Then don't say I didn't warn you." He turned on his heel and stormed off without another word. Cole watched him go with a frown. "He's not going to let this go, Dad." "No," Raymond said quietly, eyes following Leonard's retreating figure. "He isn't. And that makes him dangerous." 2 hours later, the quiet street was disrupted by the sound of approaching sirens. Patrol cars rolled into Oak Ridge Meadows and stopped right in front of Raymond's home. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, whispering to one another. Leonard stood on his lawn, arms folded, a triumphant smile tugging at his lips. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. Soon Raymond Carter would be in handcuffs, humiliated in front of everyone. But the moment the deputies stepped out of their vehicles, Leonard's plan began to unravel. Deputy Sanchez, a seasoned officer with 15 years on the force, approached with measured steps and a skeptical expression. He had been the one to take Leonard's call, a dramatic account of being threatened by a hostile neighbor, and something about it hadn't sat right from the start. "Mr. Carter?" Sanchez called as he approached the porch. "Yes, officer," Raymond replied evenly, standing up to meet him. "We received a report of a verbal threat made during a property dispute," Sanchez said, glancing briefly at his notes. "Mind telling me what happened?" Raymond folded his hands behind his back, his posture calm and respectful. "We had a conversation about my flagpole. I declined to remove it." That's all. Did you make any threats toward Mr. Baxter? No, sir, Raymond replied firmly. Not a single one. Sanchez studied his face, then looked over at Leonard, who was hovering nearby, impatient and agitated. He's lying, Leonard shouted. He said I'd regret it if I pushed him any further. That's a threat. Raymond didn't even blink. I told him that harassment has consequences and that I know my rights. That was the full extent of my statement. Sanchez's radio crackled. Dispatch to Unit 12. Confirm suspect's name? Raymond Carter, Sanchez replied. There was a pause on the other end. Then, copy that. Carter as in Chief Carter? Former precinct commander? Sanchez's eyebrows lifted slightly. He turned back to Raymond, this time with a hint of recognition. You're that Raymond Carter? I am, Raymond admitted quietly. Retired last year. Something shifted in the air. The deputies exchanged looks, the tension on their faces easing. Leonard's grin faltered as he noticed the sudden change. What does that have to do with anything? He demanded. Sanchez faced him now, his tone more measured. Mr. Baxter, I need to ask, did Mr. Carter ever explicitly threaten violence toward you? Leonard hesitated. Well, not violence, but he said I'd regret it. Which could mean legal action, Sanchez pointed out. That's not a threat under the law. Leonard's face turned red. You're just taking his side because he's one of you. Sanchez sighed. No, sir. We're following procedure. Filing a false report is a serious offense. The words hit Leonard like a slap. False report? I told you what happened. Your statement doesn't match the testimony or the context, Sanchez said firmly. And now that I know who Mr. Carter is, I'm going to request the body cam footage from this interaction for review. If it shows that your claim was fabricated. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Cole stepped closer to his father, his voice low. You think he's realizing what he just did? Oh, he's realizing, Raymond murmured. And it's only the beginning. Across the street, neighbors had gathered on their lawns, murmuring among themselves. Some had their phones out, recording. Leonard, once the self-assured enforcer of Oak Ridge Meadows, now stood frozen in the center of it all, sweat gathering on his forehead. His attempt to humiliate Raymond had backfired spectacularly. And the fallout was only just beginning. Sanchez handed Raymond a card. We may follow up for a statement, but as far as I can tell, you've done nothing wrong here. Thank you, officer, Raymond said, shaking his hand. I appreciate your professionalism. As the deputies returned to their vehicles, Leonard stayed rooted to the spot, his clipboard dangling uselessly at his side. He had gone too far this time, and deep down he knew it. Filing a false police report wasn't a petty HOA game. It was a crime, and now that crime was attached to his name. What Leonard didn't know was that the officer receiving his complaint had already raised an eyebrow at the inconsistencies in his story, and that Raymond Carter's name rang more than a few bells back at the station. Because Raymond wasn't just another homeowner, he was Chief Raymond Carter, the recently retired head of the very police department Leonard had just called. And this time, Leonard's arrogance wasn't just overreach. It was a criminal act. The night after the deputies left Oak Ridge Meadows, Raymond Carter stood alone on his porch long after the lights had gone out in most of the neighborhood. A light drizzle fell from the dark sky, soaking the leaves and carrying the faint smell of wet earth. He folded his hands behind his back and stared quietly at the flagpole that had become the symbol of his resistance. He wasn't angry, not anymore. What he felt now was clarity. Leonard Baxter wasn't going to stop. Men like him never did. They pushed until someone pushed back harder. And Raymond had spent an entire career studying exactly how to handle men like Leonard. Are you really going to do it? Cole's voice broke the silence. He stepped out onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, the glow of the kitchen lights spilling behind him. Raymond didn't turn. It's already done, he said softly. I just haven't pulled the trigger yet. Cole joined his father at the railing, following his gaze toward Leonard's house across the street. He's scared, Cole said. I saw it in his face today. That false report backfired. It did, Raymond agreed. But humiliation isn't the same as justice. And justice? That's what we're after. From that night onward, Raymond shifted from defense to offense. While Leonard continued his petty crusade, slipping bogus violation notices into mailboxes, drafting new rules that targeted Raymond specifically, Raymond built a case with the precision of a surgeon. Every time Leonard trespassed onto his property to inspect something, Raymond's discreetly placed cameras caught him in the act. The footage showed Leonard stepping over property lines, photographing Raymond's backyard, even rifling through his trash. Each threatening letter Leonard sent, some written in an attempt to intimidate, others laced with veiled insults, was neatly filed away. Raymond cataloged everything: dates, times, witnesses, even the envelopes. He knew that details, no matter how small, were the difference between a hunch and a conviction. But Raymond didn't stop there. He went door to door, quietly talking to neighbors, not as a former chief, but as a concerned resident. At first, many were hesitant to speak, fearful of retaliation. Leonard's influence had seeped deep into the community, but once Raymond showed them the evidence he had, their stories began to pour out. "Leonard threatened to fine me for planting roses," one man admitted, shaking his head. "Said they weren't on the approved list." "I didn't even know there was a list." "He told me he'd report my son's car to the city if I didn't vote his way on the HOA board," another confessed. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, and it painted a damning picture. Leonard hadn't just been abusing his power. He had weaponized the HOA to enrich and protect himself. One night, while Cole sifted through the growing stack of documents at Raymond's kitchen table, he froze mid-page. "Dad," he said slowly, tapping a highlighted section of a financial report. "Do you see this?" Raymond leaned over his shoulder, eyes narrowing. A pattern emerged. Association funds funneled into maintenance contracts paid to a company that didn't exist. Follow the trail long enough, and it led straight to a private account under Leonard's name. Raymond exhaled deeply. "That's embezzlement." Cole nodded grimly. "And that's not just an HOA violation. That's a felony." From that point forward, the operation moved beyond Raymond's living room. Cole, who still worked as a detective with the department, contacted Internal Affairs. Together, they began assembling a comprehensive file, a dossier so detailed that it would withstand any legal scrutiny. It included the harassment evidence, the fabricated reports, the testimonies of residents, and now financial records showing misappropriation of funds. Days turned into weeks, and Leonard, oblivious to the storm building around him, continued to dig his own grave. He strutted through the neighborhood with renewed arrogance, convinced that the lack of immediate consequences meant he had escaped unscathed. He even doubled down, drafting a motion to force Raymond to vacate his property for being a disruptive element in the community. "He's getting desperate," Cole observed one afternoon, flipping through another stack of papers. "Good," Raymond replied with a faint, knowing smile. "Desperate men make mistakes, and mistakes make evidence." Then, one Thursday morning, the trap quietly snapped shut. As Leonard sat in his HOA office drafting another self-important email, a courier arrived with a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter, official, stamped and signed, from the district attorney's office. It was a notification of an active investigation into allegations of harassment, financial misconduct, and filing a false police report. The news spread through Oak Ridge Meadows faster than gossip ever had. By sunset, every porch light seemed to glow a little brighter, every conversation a little louder. Neighbors who once avoided Raymond now stopped to talk. "Is it true?" they asked. "Are they really investigating him?" Raymond only offered the same measured response each time. "We'll see where the facts lead." But even as the investigation loomed, Raymond wasn't satisfied. He didn't want Leonard's reckoning to happen quietly, behind closed doors. Men like Leonard thrived on appearances, the illusion of authority, the fear they inspired. Stripping that away in public, in front of the very people he had bullied, would not only end his reign but undo the power he had wielded for years. So Raymond waited. He let the investigation move in silence while Leonard continued to puff himself up at meetings, unaware that every word he spoke was being scrutinized. He attended the next HOA session as if nothing had changed, calling for new security measures and lecturing residents about responsibility. But this time, Raymond was there too, sitting quietly in the back of the room with a folder resting on his lap. the same folder that had already made its way to the DA's office. The trap was no longer just set. It was ready to spring. Raymond had seen Leonard's type before. Men drunk on authority, convinced rules were weapons to be used, not followed. So while Leonard strutted around issuing bogus fines, Raymond had been gathering a case of his own. He installed discreet security cameras that recorded Leonard trespassing onto his property. He saved every letter, every email dripping with threats and lies. He spoke to neighbors quietly, documenting how Leonard had pressured them into silence and fabricated complaints. And now, after the false police report, Raymond had all he needed. His son Cole, a detective with the department, contacted Internal Affairs. Together, they built a comprehensive file that included Leonard's harassment, misuse of HOA funds, and even evidence of him funneling association money into his personal account. The day Leonard called the sheriff was the day that file landed on the district attorney's desk. And yet, Raymond didn't gloat. He waited. Because Leonard's downfall would be most poetic if it happened not behind closed doors, but in front of the very people he had bullied for years. 2 weeks later, the Maplewood Heights Community Center was packed tighter than anyone could remember. Folding chairs lined every wall, and still men stood in the back, arms crossed, murmuring to one another. The air buzzed with anticipation and tension. A storm everyone knew was coming, even if they didn't yet understand its size. This was no ordinary HOA meeting. Word had spread about the investigation, and residents who hadn't attended a meeting in years showed up to see if the rumors about Leonard Baxter were true. Leonard arrived late, of course. He strutted into the room like a man stepping onto a stage, his tailored blazer buttoned, chin lifted high, eyes sweeping across the crowd with calculated authority. "Gentlemen," he said, clapping his hands once as he approached the podium, "I'm thrilled to see such engagement in our community. It means people care about Maplewood Heights, and that's what this association is all about: order, standards, and preserving the value of our neighborhood." There were polite nods from a few loyal board members, but most of the room remained silent. Leonard either didn't notice or chose to ignore the shift in atmosphere. He launched into a speech about new landscaping rules, parking enforcement, and problem residents who refused to cooperate. It was clear who he meant, though he never said Raymond's name. Raymond sat 3 rows back, calm and unreadable, a man watching a storm he knew was about to break. Cole stood beside him, a thick manila folder tucked under his arm. At one point, Leonard's eyes met Raymond's, and for the briefest second his confident smile faltered. Then he straightened his shoulders and continued. "Before we vote on new policy," Leonard said, flipping to the next page of his agenda, "I'd like to—" "Before we talk about order," Raymond interrupted, rising slowly from his seat, his voice measured but carrying through the hall, "I think the neighborhood deserves to see something." The room went still. Leonard blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Mr. Carter," he said with forced patience, "this is not on the agenda." "It will be," Raymond replied calmly. "Cole?" Cole stepped forward and set the thick folder on the table in front of Leonard. The sound of it hitting the wood echoed through the silent room. Leonard frowned, his eyes darting to the folder, then back to Raymond. "What is this?" "Evidence," Raymond said simply, "of what's really been happening in Maplewood Heights." Cole flipped open the folder. The first page was a still image from a security camera. Leonard, flashlight in hand, trespassing onto Raymond's property under the cover of night. A projector hummed to life, and suddenly the back wall filled with footage. Gasps rippled through the room as the video played. Leonard stepping over property lines, photographing yards without permission, even opening a neighbor's mailbox. A federal offense. That's taken out of context," Leonard stammered, sweat beading at his temple. "I was conducting inspections, as is my duty as president." "Inspections don't happen at 2:13 a.m., Raymond cut in, his tone still even. "And they don't involve breaking into private mailboxes." The next document was projected, a ledger of HOA expenses. Cole highlighted a series of payments to a company called Westlake Maintenance Services. Then he held up another sheet. "This company doesn't exist. It's a shell," he explained. "And the account those funds were transferred into?" He turned to Leonard. "It's yours." The crowd erupted into shocked whispers. A man in the back shouted, "You stole from us?" Another rose from his seat, fists clenched. "You've been taking our dues for years!" Leonard's face drained of color. "This is nonsense," he shouted, slamming his hands on the podium. "Lies! Fabrications! None of this will hold up." "Then perhaps," a firm voice called from the entrance, "you'd like to explain it downtown." Every head turned as two uniformed officers stepped into the room, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Leonard stumbled back from the podium as one of them pulled a folded paper from his belt. "Leonard Baxter," the officer said clearly, "you are under arrest for filing a false police report, criminal harassment, and financial misconduct." "No, this is a mistake," Leonard sputtered, backing toward the wall as the officers approached. "You can't do this to me. I run this community." "You did," the officer replied coldly. "Not anymore." The click of handcuffs closing around Leonard's wrists was followed by stunned silence. As they let him out of the community center, residents pressed back against the walls to make room. The man who had once strutted through their streets issuing orders and threats now shuffled past them in disgrace, his face pale, his lips trembling. One man, emboldened by years of pent-up anger, muttered, "How's that for community standards?" Within a month, Leonard's world collapsed. Formal charges were filed. His assets were frozen. Civil suits followed from residents he had targeted and defrauded. The HOA board unanimously voted to remove him from office, and soon after, the residents themselves voted to dissolve the HOA entirely, replacing it with a voluntary neighborhood committee focused on collaboration rather than control. Life in Maplewood Heights slowly transformed. Neighbors waved to each other again. Yards bloomed without fear of citations. The air felt lighter, freer, unburdened by the weight of Leonard's tyranny. On a quiet Sunday morning, Raymond sat on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee, the same flagpole Leonard had once tried to ban standing proudly in his yard. Cole joined him, settling into the chair beside him with a satisfied grin. "He really thought calling the cops would save him," Cole said, shaking his head. Raymond chuckled softly, his eyes on the calm street before them. "Sometimes," he said, "the loudest ones forget who's really in charge." Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of abuse of community authority, the misuse of law enforcement resources, and the severe consequences of vigilantism. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of dignity and accountability, showing that petty harassment can lead to immediate and unexpected professional embarrassment.